Massive amounts of oil have been discovered in Israel. Omer ushers in Palestinian state. The Palestinian state will be a temporary measure to allow the Israelis time to strengthen their military. Catastrophe hits America. One of America's greatest times of need. Israel refuses to help America. Israel is attacked. America sends troops. Chaos reigns as Americans protest help to Israel. The fall of America will start with an internal revolution started by the communists. Some of the people will start fighting against the government. Then from the ocean, Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Central America, Mexico, and 2 other countries attack. America is defeated in 1 hour. Topics like these are discussed by the guests of the Prophecy Club, where we let the watchmen speak. And now, here is your host of the Prophecy Club, Stan Johnson.
The topic tonight is Dark Secrets of the UN. Now, we prophecy students look at Revelation 13:1, Daniel 7:23, and it tells us that we're moving to world government. We read on down to Revelation 13:15 and 16, and it says the time is coming when no one will be able to buy or sell unless they have the mark of the beast. Now, folks for generations have been saying, oh, well, my grandma, my granddad used to say that Jesus is coming really soon, and the end of all of this is about to wrap up. And they've been saying that for hundreds of years. Well, folks, they've been saying it for even longer than that. So what gives us prophecy students the right to be able to say that we truly are in the last days, that we might really be that close to all of these things starting to wrap up and all of the prophecies coming to pass? Well, we take a look at our newspaper and we see prophecy coming to pass. But what about specifically, is there things happening in the world today that is moving us to a time when there will be world government, world religion, and some of the other things prophesied? Well, that's what our speaker is going to be talking on tonight, and he's uniquely qualified to do it. He was one of the commentators from Crossfire, and he was removed from that because he refused to compromise and he refused to go with the party line. Instead, he remained steadfast to the truth. And as a result of that, he began to research the UN, the United Nations. For 4 years, he researched them. And as a result, he wrote a book called Global Bondage, the UN Plan to Rule the World. And as a result of that book, he became the UN enemy number 1. And in the book, he goes through and he shows that in actual documents, the United Nations is planning one world government, one world religion, one world currency, one world taxes, and one world courts, one world global military, global police. All of this is coming to pass. So of a truth, we prophecy students can really say, we are in the last days. Will you help me welcome Kliff Kinkaid?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's true I've had a controversial journalistic career. And I was, for a time, on CNN's Crossfire program back in the 1980s. It was a time when, you may remember, Pat Buchanan, who was the conservative co-host then, who has since returned, was actually working in the Reagan White House as communications director. So I was given an opportunity for several occasions to sit in as the conservative co-host. And I took the job seriously. The name of the show is Crossfire. And one of the guests on one of those shows was the ambassador from Libya. Now, Libya is the kind of country that, as you know, shoots airliners out of the sky, killing innocent women and children. And so the ambassador from Libya was on the show with me, and I zeroed in on him. I thought that was my job. And I asked him about Libya's support of international terrorism. And he went on and on, you know how diplomats sometimes do. Evasions, lies, on and on. Finally, I'd had enough. And I interrupted him. I said, Mr. Ambassador, would you please shut up? Well, the producer of Crossfire took me in later and said, Kliff, you can't talk like that to an ambassador, even to an ambassador from a terrorist state like Libya. And I countered, well, At least I said, please. So I tried to be polite. Now, I also had a run-in with Rush Limbaugh because I dared to question his conservative credentials. He went after me on the air to his 20 million listeners. Before I get into my talk, let me tell you a few things about Rush Limbaugh you may not know. Of course, if you listen to his show, you hear him praise to the skies former President Reagan. You'd listen to Rush Limbaugh and think, here's a hardcore Reaganite, someone who really believed in Ronald Reagan. Did you know he never voted for Ronald Reagan? Never. He didn't vote. He didn't register to vote till 1986 when he was 35 years of age. Now he comes across on his radio show as the epitome of morality and virtue. That's what he calls himself. Do you know he opposes constitutional protections for the unborn? On other issues, do you know that he supports NAFTA and GATT? Now, he once gave an interview to a Christian magazine and said Jesus was the answer to all of our problems. Then he went on to give an interview to Playboy magazine. And on top of that, he gave an interview to Penthouse magazine. Does that sound Christian to you? So I got in trouble with Rush Limbaugh as well. Then I wrote a book about Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy magazine, the leading pornographer. We'll talk about that later. I got into trouble with him. His magazine ran a full-page article denouncing me as a right-wing kook. You can make your own judgment on that. We'll talk about that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here not as a prophet. I'm not a visionary. I don't have any particular insights. Nothing extraordinary, really, except one thing: facts. Facts, which any good journalist can dig out. Truth. I'm going to give you the facts. I'm going to give you the truth. You make your own judgment. You can think for yourself. You come to your own conclusions. I am a journalist. I have a journalism degree. And when I was in journalism, they taught us to answer the basic questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Lately, they've added another question: so what? What is the significance of anything? Why should I bother to report anything? Why is it newsworthy? Why is it relevant? The United Nations is relevant, and I'm going to answer that question: so what? It's because of what the flag represents. The United States of America. That's so what. Our country is slipping away from us. A more appropriate term for it might be they're stealing it away from us. Now, I happen to believe that this country was founded by men who were divinely inspired. I think they had divine guidance. I think they conceived a unique experiment in human history in which our rights came from God. They came up with a plan for limited government, a constitutional republic. But we've been under assault from within. That flag is not the only flag that flies on American territory. The United Nations flag, up there in New York City, on American soil, flying on 18 acres of American territory. They've been here 51 years. They're literally above our law. Those who work for the UN from foreign countries can rape, they can kill, they can also engage in less serious offenses like not paying their parking tickets, their rents, getting into fights with New York City police, all of this and more. And if they're caught, you know what they do? They cite diplomatic immunity. Above the law. In the same sense that we sent our people to the moon and they planted that American flag on the moon, the United Nations has staked out its claim on American soil, a base of operations in our own country. It's been called, and it's true, a Trojan horse on American soil. The United Nations today, from its base on American soil, is in over 100 different countries. Over 50,000 employees worldwide, about 8,000 of them in New York City, involved in things like military peacekeeping, global environmentalism, economic globalization, the global economy, educational and cultural activities, global security, disarmament, and even criminal tribunals and prosecutions. Now, there is, in the UN Charter, a reference to something called the International Court of Justice, the World Court. But it doesn't have much impact. It issues rulings or opinions, and countries are free to ignore them. Right now, the United Nations is negotiating something they call the International Criminal Court. This is a court that's going to have the power to enforce its will on countries like the United States. In fact, to put people like you in foreign jails when you're accused of serious crimes. The United Nations was 50 years old in 1995. They even lighted up their headquarters building. How about that? So proud of it. Today, though, the United Nations teeters on the edge of financial bankruptcy. They've been spending themselves into bankruptcy. And you know who they want to bail them out? This is the place where the United Nations General Assembly meets. It's a magnificent structure, really. 185 nations, most of whom despise what America stands for. They have no gratitude for the United States of America, even though we have brought more freedom and prosperity to more people in the history of the world than any other nation. They despise us, yet they set the agenda of the World Organization. They decide its budget, and they decide to stick Uncle Sam with most of the bill. You can be sure of that. Who are these people who work for the United Nations? Check out the UN Charter itself and their own staff regulations, and you'll find that UN employees are international officials. They have no allegiance to any country at all. Certainly no allegiance to the United States, their host. They discharge their functions and duties only with the interests of the United Nations, a world organization, in view. These are facts. Kofi Annan, the new Secretary General of the UN, when he took his oath of office in January of 1997, said much the same thing. As Secretary General, he said he would take no external instructions from any government, any foreign country, not even the United States. They're answerable to themselves. They're an international elite class, and they act that way. Who works on behalf of the UN besides their own substantial employees? Of that 8,000 or 9,000 they have in New York City, 1,000 alone work on, quote, public information. You know what that means: propaganda, lobbying the Congress to send more of your tax dollars up there. But there are other groups that work on their behalf. One of them, the United Nations Association, supported by millions of dollars from the tax-exempt foundations and big business. Included as members, global media, the National Council of Churches, the U.S. Institute of Peace. This is a tax-funded group, by the way. You're paying for that one. National Education Association, New York Times. These are just a few of the names, literally hundreds that are members of the UN Association. And then on top of that, we've got the Business Council for the United Nations. Look at their nice little slogan there, UN, we believe. Well, they put their money where their mouth is. They're putting millions of dollars into lobbying on behalf of the UN. Lobbying to send more of your tax dollars up there. Now, as I said, I come before you as a journalist. I'm going to give you some facts about what's happening in our country. I was trained as a journalist. I'm not here to talk about secret societies or secret organizations. I'm not going to talk about conspiracies. It's all out in the open. It didn't take a lot of digging. They're out of the closet, if you want to use that phrase. And because of what I discovered, and I put into my book, Global Bondage, I started an organization about 2 years ago called the American Sovereignty Action Project, ASAP. Sort of catchy. And in 1996, we staged 3 Washington conferences trying to educate members of Congress and their staffs about these problems. For those who are interested, including those watching by videotape, I wanted to give out our toll-free number, 1-800-362-4788, if they want a free copy of our newsletter or more information. 1-800-362-4788. By the way, I want to give you another toll-free number, a number that you can use to contact your own members of Congress, members of the House and Senate. Normally, they say call a 202 area code number. I'm going to give you a toll-free number, save you some expense. 1-800-962-3524. That'll get you the Capitol switchboard. 1-800-962-3524. Because these members of Congress work for you. You're the boss. They don't work for the UN, or they're not supposed to. Now also, in terms of my personal background, I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, the show me state. And so as a result, I brought a lot of slides to show you. I like show and tell, always have. But I want you to be able to leave this discussion, or after watching this videotape, know that Kliff Kinkaid came in here and he proved his point. No dispute, no questions. Nobody can walk out that door or at the end of this tape and say, well, he made some points, but who knows if they're true or not. One of the most interesting books I discovered in researching the UN was actually published in 1984. How Peace Came to the World. Now you'll find the UN talks a lot about peace. They're for peace and other nice sounding things. This book came out in 1984, includes an essay by a man named Robert Mueller. Remember that name. He's called the philosopher of the UN's prophet of hope. That's what they call him. He's been involved in UN affairs for about 40 years. Back in 1984, Mueller in this essay wrote about what he would, I guess as the UN prophet of hope, thought would transpire or come about over the next 10 or 15 years. Here's what he predicted. He talked about a world organization of national parks. Sounds sort of odd. Nations replaced their national holidays by world days. Forget July 4th, Independence Day. That's old-fashioned. We're going to have world days. Perhaps October 24th, UN Day. We'll all celebrate. Put out our UN flags on the porch. World religion, global education, and finally, he suggests the United States is going to start work on international taxation schemes. Now keep this in the back of your minds as we go through this presentation and see how much has actually transpired. By the way, Mueller formed what is called a World Core Curriculum, for which he won a prize from the United Nations. Now think about one element, world religion. We're seeing and hearing about it all the time. Books like this, Voices from Religion and Politics, Yes to a Global Ethic. In my studies of the UN, I've come to the conclusion that we are involved in a holy war, and the UN is a big part of it. In fact, Robert Mueller wrote his own book called New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. What happened to the old Genesis? Maybe the UN has other plans for a new Genesis. And what I've discovered, and I argue it in my book, in a chapter called Holy War, is that the current Pope, John Paul II, based on what the Vatican has been doing at UN conferences, is involved in a life and death struggle with the United Nations and what it represents. I've seen this up close. I've seen these battles take place over human life issues, abortion, homosexuality, family issues. In fact, Pope John Paul II has openly referred to the UN and other international agencies, some official, some not, as being involved in what he calls a culture of death, a conspiracy against life. And he referred to one UN conference on population issues as the snare of the devil. This is a holy war. It is a spiritual war. And yet, as you know, the Catholic Church is under assault from within. Incredible divisions within the church. One of the groups that I've covered over the years, being located and based in the Washington, D.C. area, is a group in Washington called the Institute for Policy Studies, one of these liberal left-wing think tanks that has so much influence over Washington affairs. And it just so happened that a Catholic priest by the name of Father Brian Hare, who was then associated with the U.S. Catholic Conference, taught a course at the IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies, that carried this title: Matthew Marks Luke and John. The U.S. Catholic Conference itself issued this book promoting UN-style military operations that they call peacemaking. What is so extraordinary about this, ladies and gentlemen, is that one of the first so-called UN peace operations under the President Clinton administration involved using U.S. troops to go into Haiti and throw out one government, a military regime, and bring back to power, to restore to power, a defrocked Catholic priest named Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who had been known when he was in Haiti to have organized attacks on the traditional Catholic Church in Haiti, and who had publicly endorsed what's called necklacing, putting flaming tires around the necks of people and burning them alive to death. Nevertheless, in spite of this, the U.S. Catholic Conference and the U.S. Catholic bishops continue to support the United Nations in a big way. This is from an official document they issued in 1996, in which they talked about the necessity of having a worldwide public authority. Now, that's just a euphemism for the United Nations, because they go on in this document to say specifically, political leaders and citizens have a duty to support the UN. Now, what makes this even more incredible and outrageous and ironic is, just a few months ago, the Vatican itself suspended contributions to the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF. Why? Because UNICEF, a group supposedly to protect and help children, was caught involved in abortion-related activities, distributing abortion drugs. So why does the U.S. Catholic Church continue to support the United Nations? Out of this holy war, the spiritual war that I see developing, is a new form of religion, a new world religion, a one world religion, a global religion. Who's involved in it? I'll give you one name. It might ring a bell. Jean Houston. Think about that name for a minute. Well, I describe her biography. She ran a UN conference on world religion. She's been an advisor to UNICEF. She works with government leaders in 40 countries. Pretty powerful, pretty influential. She's the director of a group called the Foundation on Mind Research. Has it rung a bell yet? She's the lady that surfaced last year in a book by Bob Woodward as a spiritual advisor to Hillary Clinton. She's the one who, with Hillary Clinton, sat up there on top of the White House in the solarium and tried to help Hillary communicate with the long-dead Eleanor Roosevelt in what critics said resembled a seance. By the way, Jean Houston also believes in the use of LSD to facilitate spiritual experiences. Of course, there's no evidence that she used LSD on Hillary Clinton. No evidence I have. You see, on the surface, the UN is for a lot of great things: children, peace, human rights. In fact, you're probably familiar with the Children's Rights Treaty. The UN wants to push this through the United States Senate. It's coming. Among other things, this treaty could outlaw homeschooling. It'll set up a group of UN experts who are going to pass judgment on our laws and decide if we're treating our kids correctly. In Britain, where they've ratified the treaty, the UN experts came in and said to some of the teachers, "You're disciplining the young people, the students, too harshly. You're violating their rights." But the UN says they're for children. Children's rights, human rights. Does the UN really protect children? Let's look at the evidence. Here's a victim of the United Nations. This is a photograph smuggled out of communist China, where, of course, you know they have a one-child per family policy. A woman who's pregnant with her second child can be forcibly taken into a clinic and aborted and sterilized. This victim is one of the lucky ones. She survived. This little girl survived and was taken to a government-run orphanage where she's being starved to death. The Chinese one-child per family policy is supported by the United Nations Population Fund, one of their biggest UN agencies. The UN has given Communist China an award for their family planning efforts. The death rates at these so-called orphanages are higher than at the Nazi death camps. Another victim. In this case, the little girl is withering away to nothing, being starved to death and tied down to the bed so she can't get out of the bed, cause any problems. They just want her to die. Does the UN protect children? Several years ago, this scandal broke out, captured on the front cover of this publication that monitors the homosexual rights movement. Turned out that a key UN agency called the Economic and Social Council had admitted as a member the International Lesbian and Gay Association, which in turn had as one of its members the notorious North American Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, whose members, as you can guess, have been arrested and prosecuted and jailed for abusing kids, sexually abusing kids. And it was only under tremendous pressure from the United States Congress that this homosexual rights group decided to expel temporarily its pedophiles. Now you might think, well, okay, the UN doesn't have a good record on children, despite its rhetoric. What about the area that we hear so much about, war criminals? Doesn't the UN have a criminal tribunal going in Bosnia, Rwanda? Aren't they trying to bring these perpetrators of that horrible genocide to justice? Aren't they working hard to try to put an end to those bloody conflicts? Except for one thing. The man who was the subject of this book, Kurt Waldheim. You remember him? He ran the United Nations for 10 years, 1972 to 1982. In 1986, he was exposed as a Nazi war criminal. Turned out the UN had in its own archives information identifying him as a suspected war criminal. They just didn't bother to look it up. So he ran the UN for 10 years. Banned from the United States in 1986 when his Nazi war record was exposed. Why don't they prosecute him? Why don't they put him on trial? By the way, he's continuing to pull down a $102,000 a year annual UN pension. Since his retirement in 1982, he's collected about $1 million in UN pension benefits. And you are helping to pay about 25% of that. He's over in Austria. He's just written his autobiography, blaming all his problems on the Jews. When he's not doing that, he's cross-country skiing, enjoying his hobbies. You're paying for it. So the UN has a war criminal on its payroll. And yet they're talking about now setting up an international criminal court to prosecute people like you. And you know who the judges could be? They could be from Libya. My ambassador friend from Libya could be a judge. They could come from North Korea, Cuba, a paragon of human rights, Iran, Sudan, where they're persecuting and crucifying Christians. That's the UN today. War criminals on the payroll, homosexual rights, baby killing. And as bad as that may seem, the United States government has to answer to the UN. Every year, ladies and gentlemen, our State Department has to put together this report. And we send it up to the UN under the terms of a 1992 so-called UN Human Rights Treaty, where we have to answer to them about our human rights record. We have to answer. We have to explain whether we're meeting their standards. A report to the UN Human Rights Committee. Again, these experts could come from Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Libya. Among other things, the last time they had one of these sessions up at the UN headquarters in New York City, our State Department officials had to go up there and answer a series of questions. They were grilled, they were interrogated. For example, the UN experts wanted to know why in the United States of America we still have anti-sodomy laws on the books in 25 states. Isn't that a violation of human rights? Isn't that discrimination against the homosexuals? Why have we not given statehood to the District of Columbia? Isn't that a violation of human rights? That's the nonsense we're getting from the UN, and we're in the trap ourselves because the U.S. Senate ratified that treaty, one of more than 200 such treaties, which now authorize UN interference or monitoring of the United States. Yeah, they're busy trying to figure out why we haven't given statehood to D.C., whether there's discrimination against homosexuals here. But you know what? They're silent. They're silent about the persecution of Christians in communist China. That's not an issue. They're silent about the persecution of Christians in places like North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and the Islamic countries and Arab countries, Sudan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and Algeria. They're silent. It's a non-issue. Even though Michael Horowitz of the Hudson Institute says that the Christians are going to be the Jews of the 21st century. But it's not an issue for the United Nations. I think you probably concluded by now that the United Nations does not share a traditional Christian worldview. In fact, they believe in something quite different, something that at first glance seems rather strange and odd, and it's evidenced by this place. This is in the UN headquarters up in New York City. Now, I've sort of taken you on a little tour of the UN, showed you the General Assembly Hall, the building. If you go up there and take a tour, they won't let you get in this place. This is off limits to you, even though you're an American citizen and you've paid most of the bills for this operation. This is, well, let me put it this way. The current Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, was married in this place to his current wife, who's from Sweden. The New York Times referred to it as the UN Chapel. Does it look like a chapel to you? Got a piece of modern art on the back there. Big block of something or other in the middle, a light coming down from the ceiling. This is actually called, its official title is the UN Meditation Room. This is where UN officials go in to contact certain spiritual forces. Don't take my word for it. A book came out on this subject, ladies and gentlemen, called Spiritual Politics, written by two people, Corn McLaughlin and Gordon Davidson, who have been working with the UN over the years. And they claim in their book that this meditation room is one of the holiest of the holies on the planet. And they say that, indeed, UN officials have mystical experiences there. They have contact with certain spiritual forces. One of the authors, Davidson, says he meditated daily in this room and experienced a very powerful energy, helping to support the synthesis of nations and the emergence of the soul of humanity. By the way, this book insists that there is a spiritual government in existence and working through the United Nations today. One of the authors, McLaughlin, has actually worked with a group called the President's Council on Sustainable Development. We'll talk more about that later. She has also taught meditation classes at the Environmental Protection Agency. They have spoken at forums sponsored by a group called World Goodwill, another nice-sounding phrase, which is actually an activity of a group called the Lucis Trust, whose members follow the writings of a Russian-born woman named Madame Blavatsky, who wrote a book called The Secret Doctrine. It's not a secret doctrine. There's nothing secret about it. It's as old as human history. It's the story of how man wants to become God. This apparently is what is happening inside the UN meditation room. Blavatsky herself believed in meditation, telepathy, ESP, astrology, magic. This group, World Goodwill, also distributes literature referring to the custodians of the plan. They keep referring to the plan. They also talk about world servers and a world teacher, who they sometimes call the Christ, who they say will come again. They get together, they hold meetings, and they do chants. They have invocations, is what they call them, where they refer to the masters of ageless wisdom, who they say focus energy on the United Nations General Assembly, and who help people down here on earth carry out the plan. These are their words. And I want to play for you one of these invocations.
From the point of light within the mind of God, let light stream forth into the minds of men. Let light descend on earth. From the point of love within the heart of God, let love stream forth into the hearts of men. May Christ return to us. From the center, where the womb of God is known, let purpose guide the little worlds of men, the purpose which the masters know and serve. From the center, which we call the race of men, let the plan of love and light work out, and may it seal the door where evil dwells. Let light and love and fire restore the plan on earth.
Now listen to this. I think if I'd been in there as a journalist covering this thing, I would have ran out of there screaming. That, by the way, was supposed to be the sound of creation. There's another group that works closely with the UN on spiritual issues called the Temple of Understanding. This group actually wanted to build a temple of understanding in New York City where they wanted all the religions to come together. They believe no religion is any better. It's as good as any other. Now the idea has changed, though, and they want to construct, instead of a temple of understanding, something they call the Peace Pyramid. This is their official literature. We are already one. The Peace Pyramid. The actual architecture shows the place to be 3 levels, representing spirit, mind, and body. The top level, the people are on the bottom. The top level will feature a radiating hologram of the earth. I guess they're going to put it near Washington, D.C. so Hillary can get there easier. Right? This group has a newsletter in which they have articles like this. This particular article was written by then UN Secretary Boutros Ghali on faith in the United Nations. And they have, as you can see, a picture of a little boy praying, whether he's praying to the UN or for the UN, or maybe both. Now, I think you can see, ladies and gentlemen, that this approach constitutes a categorical rejection of traditional Christianity. These people do not believe that there's a gulf between man and God that has to be breached by Christ. If it is a Christ, in their opinion, it's somebody else, some other messenger, some other teacher. Their philosophy holds that man can become God, either through meditation, mystical experiences, or the use of mind-altering drugs. Very critical. And they also tend to see God as being present in nature. In fact, you and I know, we're all familiar with the separation of church and state. Here in the United States, we hear it all the time. That means the government cannot in any way subsidize or support Christianity. But that hasn't stopped the United Nations from using our tax dollars to push its own particular brand of religion. This comes out of the UN Environmental Program. It's a campaign, a project they call the Environmental Sabbath. This is from the UN. Your tax dollars are helping to pay for this. They are attempting to replace God with the earth. This is their logo. The UN Environmental Program was started back in 1972 by a character named Maurice Strong. He is the founder of a group called the Earth Council, which is now promoting what is called an Earth Charter to protect Mother Earth. There's a journal called Earth Ethics, which is currently debating how this charter is going to be proceeding and when, perhaps in a year or a couple, the United Nations is going to be asked to approve it. One of the issues they're debating, ladies and gentlemen, is, as part of this Earth Charter to protect Mother Earth, whether animals should have special rights. In fact, the Earth Ethics Journal has an article describing apes, these are gorillas, as our closest relatives and fellow animals entitled to the basic rights of human beings. Which leaves open a question. If you give gorillas rights, how will they know they have them? Guess the UN hasn't thought that far along yet. The logical consequence of this earth worship is the kind of activity represented by the alleged Unabomber, who conducted a 17-year bombing campaign, killing 3 people and injuring 23, waged against people who he thought were raping the earth. That's the logical consequence of radical environmentalism. And they're targeting our children. Our children, their earth. This is out of the UN Environmental Program's Environmental Sabbath Project. Among the other things that they recommend in here for kids is they want children to go outside and sit around a tree and meditate. Here's another exercise called Mount Olympus that they want kids to do. The students are supposed to form a delegation from planet Earth to plead the case for human survival from the gods, also known as the lords of the universe. But the gods are not convinced that humanity is worth saving. They feel the long-term prospects for Earth are not good and are discussing drastic action. Burn them off with global warming, send a disease to wipe them off, or try another messenger to teach human beings what they are doing wrong. Another messenger, huh? Maybe the first messenger, Christ, didn't do the job, huh? Maybe we need another one, kids. And who might that other messenger be? Who do you think it could be, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I'll tell you, from the point of view of the children, it's Captain Planet. The kids who watch these Saturday morning cartoon programs watch Captain Planet. He's the savior of the earth. He's the messenger. He gets his supernatural powers from the Planeteers, who are pictured there with their rings glowing. And you know where the Planeteers get their powers from? Gaia, the spirit of the earth. Well, if they're not watching cartoons, maybe they're reading the comic books. Superman, he's now for the earth. He used to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. No longer. I guess that's old-fashioned. Now he's fighting for the earth. Fighting to save the earth from you, the humans. In 1995, the United Nations really came out of the closet in a big way on its anniversary. Its 50th anniversary, they published this, A World in Our Hands, in which Boutros Boutros-Ghali gives an introduction. And in it, this is supposed to be written by, of, for, and about kids. They come right out and say, here's the answer. Our next generation has to do this. Build a world government. This is right out of a UN-sponsored publication calling on kids to build the world government. We'll make it democratic, but it's going to be a global government. The United Nations is very active in the public schools. And I'm going to show you very quickly several of the curriculum guides they are distributing and have done so in our own public schools. This is a UN curriculum guide for elementary school kids. On top of that, this is from the United Nations Association, again, targeting school kids. This is the same group I mentioned earlier, one of whose members is, not surprisingly, the National Education Association. UN 50 logo up at the top, the symbol. This was distributed by the UN in the public schools, targeting kids by asking teachers, for example, to do things like bring the kids together in your classroom and have them write a global citizen newsletter. How many of you remember the Weekly Reader? 1995, this one went out to 2 million second graders. The United Nations works for peace. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's totally devoted to favorably praising the United Nations. Again, the target, second graders. The photograph actually shows some smiling teenagers on the streets with a UN military vehicle in the background. No big deal, just another UN military vehicle going through the streets. Why should we get upset about that? Yeah, just another day. Finally, this is what was imposed on kids in a Pennsylvania public school in the 5th grade, where the kids were actually asked to sign a Pledge of Allegiance to the world with the UN symbol at the top there. I pledge allegiance to the world, to cherish every living thing, to care for the earth and sea and air with peace and freedom everywhere. At least the UN can rhyme. This is what's coming down, ladies and gentlemen. You see, because if you don't accept the world government, if you resist, maybe your kids will accept it voluntarily. Maybe they'll eagerly embrace it. Maybe they'll demand it. Become a citizen of the world. This is the message for kids. Now, before you say, oh, he probably picked this up at some peacenik rally somewhere, You look at the fine print, this is produced by the National Council for the Social Studies. This is the group of teachers, professional educators who are supposed to teach American history to your kids. Finally, this is my favorite. We all remember G.I. Joe, the little action figure. They're still selling G.I. Joe at the toy stores. They also have G.I. Jane, I understand. But they also have these. These little action figures for preschoolers. Notice carefully. No reference to the U.S. Army, the Navy, no branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. It's the World Force Response Team. These are little action figures responding for the world. For the world. They're not fighting for some country. That's old-fashioned. They're fighting for the world. Little one on the right there looks suspiciously like a UN-style soldier, except the beret is green, not blue. And guess where these were made? Communist China. Part of our $40 billion trade deficit. Now you're probably saying at this point, well, it's bad, of course. Sure, it doesn't look good. But on the other hand, certainly the Boy Scouts of America wouldn't fall victim to this kind of globalistic nonsense. They've got to be immune from this. And I don't present this to condemn the Boy Scouts of America. I was involved in the Scouts. My oldest boy, 9 years old, is involved in the Cub Scouts. Nevertheless, they're now offering this. Citizenship in the World Merit Badge. Mainly devoted to highlighting the virtues of the United Nations in the field of so-called international law and the global economy. Citizenship in the world. It's required for the highest rank of Eagle Scout. Young people grow up, teenagers, they like music, they can get this CD, One World, featuring artists from different countries, multicultural music, multinational. Some of the proceeds from this CD actually went to the United Nations Children's Fund. Go up to the colleges level, courses like this, Tufts University Peace and Justice Studies. This is code language for promoting the UN and the field of international law. They also run pro-UN courses under the title of Courses on Sustainable Development. We'll talk about that more. Meanwhile, you might ask, what has happened to old-fashioned American history? The history that the National Council for the Social Studies is supposed to be teaching our young people. We know the answer to that because the federal government itself produced this in 1994 from the National Department of Education. They surveyed, they questioned young people in the public schools and the private schools about what they knew about American history. One of the questions they asked the fourth graders was this: what was happening in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776? Now think long and hard about that one. Let's see. Philadelphia, summer of 1776. Maybe something having to do with an American Revolution, perhaps. Only 7% of our fourth graders could get it right. They asked our fourth graders why the Pilgrims came to America. Only 41% could answer correctly. Religious freedom. As I say, it's out of the closet, it's out in the open. A Harvard academic named Michael Sandel produced this book last year, in which he comes right out and says the answer, we have to train our young people to become global citizens. He's not the only one. A political scientist from Princeton University named Richard Falk says the same thing. We need global citizenship, Falk says, premised upon global or species solidarity. This particular Princeton University professor, Falk, is with a group called the World Order Models Project. These are different languages represented on their literature because they have experts from various countries coming together, including, you might notice, the Russian there. These experts come together and they're working on what they call global constitutionalism. They are putting together a global constitution. You remember the U.S. Constitution? That's old-fashioned. In fact, his group won an award from UNESCO, which is a UN agency called the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, for promoting global constitutionalism and a just world order. Ladies and gentlemen, if any of this sounds incredible to you, consider this. Current Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a former general counsel for the ACLU, has publicly stated that the U.S. Constitution is an outdated document. Not appropriate, she says, for a modern state. She says it is skimpy on individual rights, that the Bill of Rights has, quote, distinct gaps in it. Ms. Ginsburg is supposed to be in line to become Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court under Bill Clinton if the current Chief Justice, William Rehnquist, retires. This is the future, and the future is now. I want to start out with some good news. This is the cover of a magazine that exists showing resistance to the United Nations from inside the U.S. Armed Forces. This publication is called The Resistor, and it exists for those who are in the U.S. military today who object to UN foreign command and control of our troops. Now, as you could imagine, those who write for this publication choose to remain anonymous. They write under pseudonyms. But the reality is that there is increasing demoralization within the U.S. military at what is happening to them. And there is active resistance. Now, you may remember a couple years ago, there was a survey done of Marines at the 29 Palms Marine Base, asking them a series of questions about whether they would serve as part of UN operations. One of the questions had to do with whether these Marines, as being part of a UN mission, would shoot Americans resisting confiscation of their firearms. 25% of those who answered the survey said they would shoot Americans, but 75% said no. And some said, absolutely not, no way. Very strong, adamant reaction. I wrote an article about Michael New a couple years ago. Of course, you remember Michael New as the U.S. Army specialist who said no to the UN. Specifically, he said he would not wear a UN shoulder patch and a UN blue beret or blue helmet, which constitutes the United Nations uniform. He resisted, he said, because he took a sacred oath as a soldier, swearing allegiance to the U.S. Constitution. When he went to his superiors and told him that he didn't want to go to Macedonia, where he would have to report to a foreign commander, formerly in Yugoslavia, his commander said, go and read the UN Charter. So Michael New went and read the UN Charter. He took the UN Charter and he compared it to the U.S. Constitution. And he came back to his superior officer and said, they are not compatible. I am sticking with my oath as a soldier, and the rest is history. He was court-martialed and given a bad conduct discharge, which on that basis constitutes a stigma that's going to follow him the rest of his life. Now, this created a big uproar in the United States, as you can all remember. Americans all over the country about how far we had come. In response to that, the United Nations took on a PR offensive. And I've indicated the UN has a lot of people devoted to, quote, public information, propaganda, lobbying. They've got a Washington office for the United Nations, which is run by a man named Joe Sills, pleasant fellow. He reacted to the Michael New case with this extraordinary comment that was contained in a letter to the Washington Times, in which he said, don't get alarmed. Michael New wouldn't have had to take an oath of allegiance to the UN. Joe Sills said that's only for the commanding officers, who, he admitted, become temporary UN employees during their UN service. According to Joe Sills, Michael New wouldn't have had to take direct orders from the UN, but he would have had to take orders from a UN commander who did so. As if this is a big difference. It's the same chain of command, the same orders are coming from the top. And I might add that there has been another incredible development regarding our U.S. military. In fact, another brave Army soldier, Sergeant Ed Razor from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, has come forward now. Now, he wasn't ordered to report to a UN operation like the one in Macedonia. He wasn't ordered to wear the UN uniform. But he personally, on moral and religious grounds, objected to the U.S. Army's growing involvement in the UN, and he put in a request for an honorable discharge from the military, and he got it. This is a precedent-setting case. So if you know people who are in the U.S. military, they can get out on honorable grounds by following the Ed Razor precedent. Now, it's a tragedy that soldiers like Ed Razor and Michael New have been forced out. We need soldiers like that within. And as I say, there are soldiers who resist the UN agenda who remain in the U.S. military, mostly functioning anonymously. And they need our support as well. Because it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, either our U.S. military forces are on the road to complete demoralization and internal collapse, or down the road, and I argue this in my book, because of these kinds of pressures on our soldiers, we are facing the prospect in the future at some point of a military coup. There's incredible pressures on these military people. They're being trained to engage in peacekeeping missions, humanitarian endeavors, and not being trained to do what they thought they were. A warfighting capability for America's national interests. It's interesting, isn't it, that both Ed Razor and Michael New were both committed Christians. They took their oath seriously. This is a sacred oath. It ends with the word, "So help me God." Now, how deep is the Army's involvement in the UN? Here's a quote for you from Dennis Reimer, the Army Chief of Staff. He's described the U.S. Army in the future as the rapid reaction force of the global village. That sounds like something Hillary Clinton would say. But it's the Army. The situation deteriorated sharply in 1992 when this document came out. Once again, the United Nations is talking peace. This time, agenda for peace, proposed by then UN Secretary General Boutros-Ghali. In it, he came right out and said, sovereignty is a thing of the past. It was a theory. These nation states, the United States of America, never matched by reality. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, in this Agenda for Peace document in 1992, Boutros-Ghali came out and said we've got to activate Articles 42 and 43 of the United Nations Charter. You've got to read this document. Because basically, Articles 42 and 43 of the UN Charter establish a standing United Nations Army. They basically say that the nations of the world will disarm and transfer armed forces and equipment to the United Nations. So the UN can fulfill its longtime objective, as outlined in the UN Charter, of maintaining peace and security. President Clinton followed that up with a Presidential Decision Directive 25, PDD 25, a public version of which suggests that the whole thing is designed to allow Clinton to deploy our troops on behalf of the UN at will. The incredible thing about this document is that we have a public version, we have a public summary, but we still don't have the actual document. In my book, you'll see I have an exchange of testimony reprinted in there between Congressman Ben Gilman, who chaired the House International Relations Committee, and then UN Secretary to the UN, Ambassador Madeleine Albright. And Gilman says to her point blank, when are we going to get in the Congress a copy of Presidential Decision Directive 25? She says right back to him, we are not going to provide that document to the Congress. Think of the arrogance And our Congress still doesn't have a copy, even though under the U.S. Constitution, it's the Congress that is supposed to set the rules and regulations to govern the armed forces. It's the Congress that is supposed to have the power to declare war. Now, there are those who say that the UN really is not much of a significant military force. Anyone who doubts that ought to take a look at these. These are some of the UN peacekeeping medals that the UN Army and their commanders give out for service over the history of the UN, has amounted to dozens of so-called peacekeeping operations. Now, I've got a little challenge for you. Anyway, anyone who's here, anyone watching by videotape, I'd like to suggest you call the Department of Defense, call the DOD, the Pentagon, and ask them how many troops, American soldiers, are serving the UN. I'll tell you what they're going to tell you. They're going to come back and say, and if you're successful, you may even get a copy of a document they have on file. This is dated in March of 1997, showing that there's only 522 American soldiers serving the UN. What's all the alarm? Don't get upset. Don't get so scared. Are you seeing black helicopters again? Only 522. Come on, ladies and gentlemen, what's the big deal? The truth is, I was able to get a more detailed document out of the Department of Defense, just using some of my journalistic initiative. This is not classified. It's an internal document, but it's not secret. I haven't broken any national security regulations. This one refers to U.S. forces participating in or acting in support of selected UN operations or United Nations Security Council resolutions. And the grand total is about 68,000. That's a far cry from 522. What's the difference? I'll tell you the difference. The difference that they won't tell you. The difference is the 522 mostly includes those soldiers who are actually wearing the UN uniform, the shoulder patch, the blue beret. Most of these are in Macedonia, in the former Yugoslavia, where Michael New was supposed to be assigned. But here's the crunch. You don't have to wear a UN uniform as an American soldier to be serving the UN. In fact, I'll just give you some of these statistics out of the about 68,000. According to this, from the DOD, all of our troops in Korea, 37,000, are still officially on a UN mission. According to the Pentagon, we've got 10,000 in Iraq, mopping up after the end of the Gulf War, still on a UN mission. And of course, Bosnia, another approximately 10,000. None of these are wearing a UN uniform, but according to the Pentagon itself, they are on UN missions. This is critical because we're going to explain later how the administration has been subsidizing UN peace operations over and above what the Congress has required or mandated or approved. Peace operations. The U.S. Army issued this field manual on peace operations several years ago. This goes into substantial detail about how the U.S. Army is working hand in glove with the UN. In fact, one of these chapters actually has an introduction written by then UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali in the U.S. Army field manual. Here's the critical document. This came out of the GAO, the General Accounting Office, in March of 1996. This gets to the point about the difference between the 522 and the 68,000. What this document shows is that over the course of fiscal years 1992 to 1995, the U.S. government spent, in support of UN peace operations, $6.6 billion. Of that figure, only $1.8 billion was counted against our so-called United Nations dues or assessments. That leaves about $4.8 billion that the Clinton administration provided on behalf of the UN, for which we did not get credit or reimbursement. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, ladies and gentlemen. Because, you know, the UN keeps insisting that we owe them $1.3 billion. The UN officials have been coming down to Washington, D.C. on a regular basis with their tin cups out, saying, you owe us, Uncle Sam, you're a deadbeat. You signed a contract with the UN and you violated your contract. You didn't pay your dues and assessments on time, and you owe us $1.3 billion. That's the debate. This argument is being played out on Capitol Hill right now, trying to convince the Congress to cough up another $1.3 billion for the UN. And this document, the GAO report, proves that it's all a big lie. Because if you take the $4.8 billion we provided in the form of assistance for UN peace operations, and you give them their argument about the phony $1.3 billion, subtract that from the $4.8 billion, what do you get? They owe us $3.5 billion. That's the bottom line. The UN and the State Department are deathly afraid that the U.S. Congress is going to try to collect that money. And let me tell you the good news. There is a bill on Capitol Hill introduced by Congressman Roscoe Bartlett of Maryland, H.R. 934, which aims to collect this money from the UN. And listen to this. Listen to the title of this bill. It's called the United Nations Erroneous Debt Act. He's got over 50 co-sponsors for it. The State Department and the UN are scared to death it's going to pass because they say it's going to bankrupt the United Nations. So there is progress being made. Congress is waking up. That's one reason the American Sovereignty Action Project, my organization, has been so active on this issue. We brought this to the attention of the policymakers on Capitol Hill. I wrote an article about this subject for the Washington Post, of all places, the liberal Washington Post. The truth is coming out. Nevertheless, the Army continues down this road. This comes out of the Special Warfare School down at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It's an official U.S. Army publication. In the bottom right, they have an article called Ambushing the Future, in which they come right out and say that in the future, almost like the Rapid Reaction Force for the Global Village, the U.S. Army will be a force of global reconstruction in a future dominated by the UN. Now, don't miss the significance of this. Again, this is not Hillary Clinton. This is not Joe Sills of the UN Information Office in Washington, D.C. This is the U.S. Army. They recognize the agenda. And they go on to say, in effect, U.S. Army troops are going to be deployed on behalf of the UN, depending on the agenda of global media, which is going to pick out various hot spots, conflicts, wars, where the troops are going to be deployed. These problems are going to become global problems, which the United Nations, being a global institution, is going to solve. And our troops are the frontline soldiers. So the United Nations has a global media, global army. Who do you think personifies the global media? Mr. Jane Fonda. Mr. Jane Fonda. Ted Turner. He has put his cable networks at the disposal of the UN. Now, I know that sounds harsh, but I personally went to one of the Turner Broadcasting annual meetings, and I asked Ted Turner personally about this. And he admitted under questioning that whenever there's a UN conference occurring, he has a deliberate policy of highlighting the themes of that conference in his programming. So he has basically made his networks propaganda vehicles for the UN. He represents the global media. By the way, he and his wife, Jane Fonda, are goodwill ambassadors officially on behalf of the UN Population Fund, the same outfit supporting the Chinese one-child per family policy. Meanwhile, Ted Turner's had 5 kids. I guess none of this is supposed to apply to the global elite. They're above all of it. We're going to pay. By the way, let's correct the record about the UN's financial situation. As I say, they come down here claiming we owe all this money. If they were truly in need, they could bail themselves out. They've got money. You know where they got it? They got it up in New York. It's called the UN Pension Fund. They've got stashed away in their own pension fund. By the way, it's the best managed program up there for obvious reasons. $15 billion invested in stocks, bonds, real estate. This is how they were able to pay Boutros Boutros-Ghali a $102,000 a year pension after he was on the job only 5 years as Secretary General. $15 billion. But they want us to pay more. My argument is simple, and I ask you to take this to your members of Congress. Number one, no more money for the UN. Make them pay. Make them pay us back. There is a debt. The UN has the debt to us. But secondly, if they're really destitute, let them do what the U.S. government has done. You know, the U.S. government taps into the Social Security Trust Fund to bring our budget more into balance. Why can't the United Nations tap into its own $15 billion pension fund to balance their books? They want our money. You see, they despise America. They don't have any appreciation for our success as a nation. But they want even more of it. And they're going to get it one way or the other. This document came out several years ago, ladies and gentlemen, called Our Global Neighborhood. Sort of sounds like Hillary's Global Village. Just a coincidence, I'm sure. Produced by a group called the Commission on Global Governance. You see, they're clever. They don't call it global government or world government. They call it global governance. One of its members is the aforementioned Maurice Strong of Canada. He was one of the members of this commission. He's now Kofi Annan's top aide up at the UN in charge of reforming the United Nations. And in this document, they come right out and say what they want: global taxation. It's time for a consensus on global taxation. In other words, let's don't argue about it, let's don't debate it, let's get on with it. We need the money. Their reform plan. They want to reform the UN by closing down some agencies, creating new ones, and ultimately getting more money from us and reducing our influence. That's the deal. Pay more, get less. Maurice Strong, very interesting fellow, now the top aide to Kofi Annan, in charge of reform, member of the Commission on Global Governance. You remember I mentioned him earlier. He's also the founder of the Earth Charter, the Earth Council, developing an Earth Charter to protect Mother Earth. Mr. Strong is a very unusual character. Among other things, he has publicly speculated that a worldwide economic collapse may be necessary to punish the rich nations, like the United States, for exploiting the world's natural resources. For a time, he lived in Denver, Colorado, and in Colorado, he had a ranch called the Baca, which was home to a spiritual community, which we would call a New Age grouping, where he thought all the religions of the world would come together. Maurice Strong publicly stated that he once saw a burning bush, almost biblically, ignite spontaneously into flames. But his religion is not like traditional Christianity. He has a more New Age version in which we worship, we reverence the earth. In order to pull off his scheme, he wants desperately more of our money in order to implement the United Nations environmental agenda, which alone is estimated to cost $600 billion a year. The UN itself, back in 1994, published this important document, the Human Development Report. These documents are not necessarily set aside or restricted in their distribution. It took a little digging. This came out of the UN Development Program, headed by a Clinton appointee by the name of James Gustav Speth. In it, they have an article by Jan Tinbergen, an economist, who says we're going to have world government. And he goes on to say we're going to get it through the strengthening of the United Nations system. Again, this is in an official UN document. This is not my interpretation or my speculation about what may have been somewhere. This is them. This is the UN talking. And they go on in this document to say that they could pass a global tax and generate revenue of $1.5 trillion a year. This particular global tax is a proposed international tax on currency transactions. The author is James Tobin. He's a Yale University economist. The tax has actually been named after him, the Tobin tax. James Speth, the director of the UN Development Program, came right out when that Human Development Report was issued, and he said, yeah, it's doable. Let's do it. This is the plan. All out in the open. No conspiracy. They're giving it right to you. They're telling it right straight to your face, and they're saying to you, Americans, try to stop us. Global governance, world government. Now, following that, a reporter actually blew the whistle on these schemes as well, although in a sympathetic vein. Stephen Solomon, former reporter for Forbes magazine, wrote this very, very revealing book. The subtitle refers to how unelected central bankers are running the global economy. What's interesting is Solomon in this book endorses the Tobin tax, but it's very clever. He says, you can start this thing out small. A little tax, just a teeny little tax on international currency transactions. We can talk about how they're going to implement it. But he says, once you get it teeny, then you ratchet it up. He says in his book, you could bring in $13 trillion a year. Now, this is not idle speculation. This is a reporter who interviewed these central bankers, these money people. This is not some fly-by-night journalist. He was in the thick of it. He's blowing the whistle. He thinks this is great. Then all these global bankers will be able to manage the future for us. Lately, they've come out with this book, 300 pages long, on how to implement the Tobin tax. 300 pages. Now, obviously, I can't summarize it all. Two of the editors are officials of the UN Development Program. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, they want to set up either a new UN bureaucracy or have UN agents placed in the various financial houses, brokerage houses, and banks to monitor financial transactions, collect their take, and send it up to the UN or other international agencies, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. What's clever about it is they're going to market this thing as an attack on the rich. They're going to go after those rich people. In truth, if you have an IRA, a mutual fund, a pension fund with any kind of international connection at all, say you have investments in a foreign country, a foreign company that has investments abroad, you'll be hit. Ordinary people are going to be hit. Now you might say, okay, all that's well and good, but they'll never pull it off. No way. No one would support this. That's crazy. There's no constituency for this. There's plenty of people who support it, mostly in the United States on the liberal left side of the political spectrum. There's a group in Washington who I referred to earlier called the Institute for Policy Studies, a Marxist-oriented think tank. One of their founders produced this book, Imperial Corporations in the New World Order is the subtitle. This gives you a hint of where they're going. They're going to market a global tax as a tax on the big bad corporations. In fact, there's another book that's been released, When Corporations Rule the World, by David Korten. This is available up at the UN bookstore in New York. He comes right out in this book and endorses the Tobin tax. And the fear is, you see these corporations, and I'm not here to apologize for big business, but think about their strategy. These big bad corporations are going to manipulate the world. They're going to run the world. So we need a Tobin tax or a global or international tax of some kind to generate the revenue necessary to enable the United Nations and other global institutions to control them. Their answer to the problem of big business is big government at an international level. Now, who else might support such a tax? Can anybody recognize this fellow? It's not Santa Claus without the beard. John Sweeney, head of the AFL-CIO, the giant labor federation. The Republicans didn't like him last election cycle because he poured tens of millions of dollars into the campaign to defeat Republicans. They got angry. They called him a big liberal. He's not a big liberal. He's a big socialist. He's a self-admitted socialist. In fact, he's a member of a group called the Democratic Socialists of America. Did you know America's largest labor federation is now run by a self-admitted socialist? Have we come that far in the United States? It's true. And the Democratic Socialists of America has a platform. This is from their official literature. And one of the planks, as you can see explicitly, is support for international taxes. International taxes on currency transactions. This is the Tobin tax. So in the name of fighting big business and big corporations, I think you're going to see giant labor come aboard this constituency for the global tax. Incidentally, the Democratic Socialists of America is the American affiliate of the Socialist International, one of whose former vice chairs was none other than Boutros Boutros-Ghali, former Secretary General of the UN. Last year in the United States Senate, Senator Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico actually introduced a variation of a global tax. Now, this is very interesting how they're trying to do this. What he introduced, he called it the Securities Transfer Excise Tax. But he was going to implement it through the back door. He didn't want the UN to impose it. Instead, he proposed that the G7 industrialized countries impose this STET, the Securities Transfer Excise Tax, and that it would, in his view, generate money, he said about $60 billion a year, to initially fund domestic initiatives in the United States, like Global 2000, Goals 2000. This was his idea. But of course, you can see the plan. If they get it through a variation of a global tax through the G7, they figure that other countries will fall in line, then it'll become global, and then you can take the revenue and use it for other purposes. Then some of the revenue could go to the UN, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Another group that would support a global tax is the Green Party. This emerged on the scene, as you know, in 1996 as a significant third-party effort, with Ralph Nader as their presidential candidate. Ralph Nader is known to be a consumer advocate, but he ran as the Green Party presidential candidate, came in fourth. The Green Party, incidentally, is represented in dozens of countries around the world. As the name implies, it's more or less an environmental party. They're very pro-United Nations. These are some of the planks from their platform. They wanted the UN Law of the Sea Treaty signed. They refer to the U.S.-Mexican border as an area of binational independence, apparently meaning that we got to send the Southwest United States back to Mexico. International peacekeeping, using the UN to maintain world order. And finally, think about this one. They want an international intelligence agency. The news is we've already got one. Last year, President Clinton's then CIA director, John Deutsch, signed a memorandum making it easier to share U.S. intelligence information with the United Nations. He did this by eliminating a traditional intelligence designation known as no foreign, N-O-F-O-R-N, meaning no foreign dissemination. This was a designation or classification that intelligence analysts knew to mean to be restricted. Information documents had to be restricted to Americans. Do not share with foreign governments or foreigners in general. With one sign of the pen, John Deutsch eliminated that designation, making it easier to send this information to the United Nations and even other foreign governments. So much of this plank is either a reality or becoming a reality. Another UN official who's promoting global taxes is a German named Bernd von Drost. He runs something called the World Heritage Center out of UNESCO in Paris. That's the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. He wants a global energy tax. Now, what's he talking about? Mr. von Drost helps oversee two very important UN programs. One is called the World Heritage Program. Another is the Biosphere Reserve Program. Together, they affect about 50 million acres of U.S. territory. Now, you may remember in November of 1995, a UN delegation flew into Yellowstone National Park. What was the UN doing in Yellowstone? They came in there to argue and agitate for a buffer zone around the park in order to stop the construction of a proposed gold mining project a couple miles outside the park. The UN came into the park basically telling us how to run our own park and our own public lands, how to conduct affairs on our own territory. And lo and behold, President Clinton complied and later announced that he had made a deal with the mining company to cancel the project. By the way, Congressman Don Young of Alaska got sick and tired of this. He got sick and tired of the UN having some form of jurisdiction over U.S. public lands. And so he introduced a bill called the American Land Sovereignty Protection Act. Remember that bill? It should pass in the Congress with the support of people like you. The American Land Sovereignty Protection Act, to keep the UN bureaucrats out of our own internal affairs when it comes to the management of our federal lands. An important piece of legislation. By the way, down in North Carolina, the citizens down there were concerned. Down at Mount Mitchell State Park, they actually saw the words United Nations on the sign leading into the park. And these people didn't take kindly to that. They don't like the UN down in North Carolina. In fact, they started shooting up the sign. So the park authorities got the message, and they changed the sign. They took the words United Nations right off it. They changed it to read an International Biosphere Reserve, not a United Nations Biosphere Reserve. But the people weren't fooled. In fact, the citizens down in North Carolina went around the other side of the sign. You know what they saw on the back? The words United Nations. The park authorities had simply turned the plank around. I didn't fool anybody. So what did the park authorities do? They put a plank over that plank. So you couldn't read the words United Nations on the back. Your government in action. The cover-up is complete. Well, now, you know, I sometimes raise questions about what the UN is doing on the public lands, and the UN and the national park authorities come back and say, oh, you're just getting people alarmed and concerned for no reason. The UN doesn't have any role in those parks. Well, if it's all so innocent, why do they have to go to these lengths to cover it up? Well, they come right out and tell us what's going on. By the way, the attempt to exercise some form of control over national parks doesn't just apply here, and national monuments, and state parks, and other scenic areas. In Bosnia, of all places, as part of the Dayton Peace Settlement, the Clinton State Department set up a commission to preserve Bosnia's national monument, with the commission chairman and members appointed by the same outfit over there in Paris, run by the UN, under the auspices of UNESCO. That peace accord also actually included a constitution for Bosnia. The Clinton State Department wrote a constitution for this country. We'll talk about that a little later. And a similar process is underway in South Africa, where they've just approved a new constitution, considered to be the most liberal in the world. This particular constitution in South Africa protects homosexual rights, abortion rights, it prohibits hate speech, and calls for sustainable development. Now, I've mentioned that term several times tonight. Let's find out what it means. If you ask the UN, they'll say sustainable development is a way that we are going to preserve natural resources for the next generation. It sounds altruistic. It sounds like we're just being good stewards. In fact, what it means is government control of natural resources. Sustainable development is one of the most clever terms that's ever come out of the United Nations. In effect, it's another word for socialism or Marxism. It's government control, government management of our natural resources, government management of the land. This time, they're doing it for the environment in the name of saving the planet. Practically speaking, here's what sustainable development means. It means, ladies and gentlemen, that you're going to have to adjust your lifestyle because you're using too many resources. You're using too much air, water, land, and energy. Their attack is nothing less than the American way of life and the American standard of living. You see, you represent the rich United States. You've used too many of the resources, and now you're going to have to pay. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population. We use 25% of the world's energy. That's too much. So they're going after you. Not surprisingly, this means in practice the deindustrialization of the United States. That's the bottom line. And we're seeing this reference to sustainable development in all kinds of publications and official documents coming out of the Clinton White House, the federal government, and the UN. Here's one example. Another, this is from the President's Council on Sustainable Development, calling for a sustainable America. Here's another, written by a journalist, Philip Shabakoff. He used to cover the environment for the New York Times. The term sustainable development is in the title of his book. And to his credit, he comes right out and tells us exactly what they're going to do. Incidentally, he interviewed Maurice Strong, the proponent of the Earth Charter to protect Mother Earth, at length. And in the book, he comes right out and says, here's the future. It's a new name for peace. We're on the road to achieving Pax Gaia, the peace of the earth. Now think about the significance of those terms. Gaia, the spirit of the earth, the goddess, worship. We are here, ladies and gentlemen, according to the UN and their apologists, to serve and save the earth. And they are cloaking all of this in religious and spiritual language. Domestically, one of their targets is Chattanooga, Tennessee. They're very active in Chattanooga. In fact, Chattanooga was an award winner at the UN Habitat II conference in Istanbul, Turkey. In Chattanooga today, they have what are called eco teams. They are empowering people, this is another term for adjusting your lifestyles, to live environmentally sustainable lifestyles. They have these 640 eco teams, as they indicate, that are going around house to house. In fact, they have a 5-year national campaign putting America's house in order, household by household. We're not talking city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community. We're talking house to house. working with the UN Environmental Program, started by Marie Strong, and the President's Council for Sustainable Development. Their intention is to remake America block by block, household by household. You may get that knock at the door. Yes, we're with your local eco team. We're just here to make sure your house is energy efficient. Do you recycle? How much trash do you generate? You got a gas guzzler out there in the driveway? Have you gotten it checked by the EPA? They're all over the United States, in many different cities, just helping you live an environmentally sustainable lifestyle. Not surprisingly, they're also targeting the kids. They have a student program where the students, if they cooperate, maybe they'll come home and say, "Mom, are you meeting the standards?" They'll have a list of them. The kids can get a Global Hero patch. Global Hero from the UN Environmental Program. Now notice their language from their own literature. Many of these actions require cooperation from the parents. Parents, cooperate or else. Requiring cooperation. You're going to have to help. Now you might think at the end of this, well, okay, they're all over the country. They're targeting the cities. What is America going to look like in the future? A deindustrialized economy? Are we all going back to the caves? Are we all going to live as peasants? The UN has been thinking that out too. In fact, they write extensively about this. The UN Development Program, the same outfit pushing global taxes, has a magazine. It's called Choices. Sounds good, doesn't it? We're not going to have much of a choice. According to this magazine, they are working on an experimental project down in Havana, Cuba, about what the future is going to look like. The title of this article is Pig Power. Pig power. Now, I bet you I got your attention on that one. What is he taught? Pig power. Here's the quote. Here's what they're doing. At this project, the pigs are pampered with meals prepared by the city's finest chefs. The magic ingredient is pig manure, which turns into a rich fertilizer and enough natural gas to fire up stoves in neighboring homes and the Pig Research Institute's central kitchens. Now, I had to bring this along. If I hadn't brought this along, you would have said, this guy is a lunatic. He is crazy. You can't possibly believe the UN is working on anything like this. Even they must have some connection to reality. This is it. This is the future. It's a world in which plants, animals, and things are given more priority than human beings. You've seen the future. In the future, we are going to pamper the pigs. Future, but I'm going to describe the activities of some people who are making the future. And one of them is George Soros. He may be the most important and dangerous man in the United States and the world today. He's got a big ego, and so he wrote a book about himself, in which he talks about his views on various world affairs and U.S. domestic issues. He's able to do this because he's worth literally billions of dollars. He runs the $10 billion Quantum Fund, and he runs several different foundations out of New York City, including one called the Open Society Institute, run by a former national director of the ACLU. He's a prominent member of the Business Council for the United Nations and the Council on Foreign Relations. He made his money through financial manipulation and speculation, by betting against currencies, whether they rise or fall, things of that nature. He was also the head of a Council on Foreign Relations task force that produced this report in August of 1996 about reforming the United Nations. Essentially, they wanted to do that by getting rid of Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the former Secretary General, and that has been completed. They got a new one in, Kofi Annan. But their basic plan is to reform the UN in order to make it stronger in the long term. Soros ran this Council on Foreign Relations task force, but he's also given a lot of thought to the future of NATO. In fact, he wrote this pamphlet in 1993 in which he came right out and said, "Towards a New World Order, the future of NATO." This is critical because George Soros and many other people realized early on that the United Nations was incompetent militarily. That was obviously evident in Somalia. When the UN took over the operation there, a nation-building scheme that failed miserably, disastrously. In fact, 18 American soldiers paid with their lives. We all remember that film footage of those soldiers being massacred in an ambush, their bodies stripped naked and dragged through the streets by mobs screaming victory over America. So Somalia was a disaster. The UN was militarily incompetent, and they decided to change their strategy. As such, in Haiti, they decided to use U.S. troops directly on a UN mission, under U.S. command. The result, as I said earlier, was to bring back to power a pro-Marxist, renegade, defrocked Catholic priest, John Bertrand Aristide, a known proponent of terrorism. George Soros realized that because the UN could not do the job militarily, you had to bring in U.S. troops directly and also NATO. What he has forecasted has come to pass. NATO has become a military arm of the United Nations. In fact, if you look at it, ladies and gentlemen, what has happened in Bosnia is a prime example of this strategy, NATO in the New World Order. NATO went into Bosnia when, again, the United Nations militarily couldn't do the job. The United Nations had to withdraw, just like they did in Somalia. NATO went in, first under the auspices of something called the Stabilization Force, but also subsequently under the auspices of the first under the Implementation Force and then the Stabilization Force. The point is, NATO has become a military arm of the UN. And think about this while we're at it. Think about the nature of NATO. How is it that NATO could get into Bosnia in the first place? George Soros may have wanted NATO to play that role, but how does it do so legally? If you analyze the NATO treaty, the NATO charter, it sets up the organization as purely a defensive alliance against Soviet-style communism. Yet, NATO intervened in Bosnia. How? On what basis? Did anybody in Bosnia declare war or shoot at or launch a conflict against a signatory to the NATO treaty? Under the treaty, members of NATO can respond, can go to the defense of other members of the treaty only if one is attacked. But the belligerents in Bosnia never attacked any member of NATO. In fact, the United States attacked them. It was an offensive use of NATO, and it was therefore completely illegal. This is critical to understand. Soros saw the future, and he may have helped to create it, because he is known to have very close ties to the Clinton administration. Very close friend, for example, of Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot. So what is the U.S. doing in Bosnia? We've already established that it's an illegal deployment. And by the way, consider the fact that the United Nations Army, through NATO, through the Implementation Force and now the Stabilization Force, has arrived. Consider this. Listen to the list of countries that are represented as part of the multinational force in Bosnia today. Besides the United States, which provides most of the troops, Britain, France, Italy, Turkey, Russia, Netherlands, Spain, Germany, Canada, Malaysia, Denmark, Czech Republic, Morocco, Norway, Sweden, Poland, Belgium, Ukraine, Egypt, Portugal, Finland, Hungary, Greece, Romania, Austria, Lithuania, Latvia, Jordan, Luxembourg, New Zealand, and Estonia. That is simply incredible, isn't it? This is a multinational force, a true world army, you might call it. And it's all being deployed, really, as part of a NATO operation. Now, this isn't just my opinion. According to the UN Security Council resolutions, the most recent being number 1088, the deployment in Bosnia is in support and authorized by a UN Security Council resolution. So it is a UN mission. It was set up like this in the first place under the Dayton Peace Accords that supposedly ended the fighting there. Now let's get to the question, because we've already established that it's illegal, what they are doing there. In effect, what our troops, working with the Russians and others, are doing is putting together a UN puppet state. This is from the official Dayton Peace Accords. The Clinton State Department, as part of this peace settlement, wrote a constitution for Bosnia. Now, isn't it interesting? They didn't model it on the U.S. Constitution. They modeled it on the UN Charter. They also set up a central bank for Bosnia, basically run by the International Monetary Fund. The United States did this. We have not only set up a puppet state for the UN, we have written their constitution. We're running the central bank through the International Monetary Fund. This is critical to understand the evolution of the UN militarily. You see, again, in Somalia, it was a disaster. It was a fiasco. They couldn't do it. In Haiti, they used U.S. troops on a UN mission, and it was successful, at least in the sense of getting rid of one government and bringing in another, which was even more, or at least equally, notorious. And then Bosnia. This is precedent-setting. This is unprecedented in human history, what the UN through NATO is trying to do in Bosnia. Again, though, I get to the question, what are we doing there? For what purpose? What is the motive? Who are our allies in Bosnia? Here's one of our allies. This is a Bosnian Muslim soldier. This is one of their favorite tactics for killing people. They chop their heads off. Now let's think about what we're doing in Bosnia. We are setting up not only a UN puppet state, but it's a Bosnian Muslim state. This is critical. You remember the brouhaha, it should have been a major scandal, over the fact that the Clinton administration covertly allowed the sending of weapons from Iran, an Islamic state, to the Bosnian Muslims. Why are we allowing and permitting and even promoting and subsidizing the creation of a Muslim state in the heart of Europe? What's the purpose of that? Who's driving this policy, and for what reason? Let's think back into history, ladies and gentlemen. This is a famous World War II photo. On the left there is Heinrich Himmler, the number 2 Nazi behind Hitler. This is a photo showing Himmler reviewing a division of Bosnian Muslim Nazi troops. Bosnian Muslim Nazis. Himmler, of course, was the mastermind and the architect of the final solution in the Holocaust. Who are the victims? Who are the targets today? Let's think about our own domestic situation. In fact, in the United States today, and I don't mean this as a blanket condemnation, there are roughly 5 million Muslims in the United States. Who are they represented by? Who speaks for them? I think you know the answer for many of them. Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam. He staged this demonstration outside UN headquarters, interestingly enough, last year on the anniversary of his so-called Million-Man March. The question, can the UN avert the war of Armageddon? Now, some might say he's pushing us towards the war of Armageddon, pushing whites and blacks towards racial confrontation. You remember Louis Farrakhan is the one who went traveling around the world in violation of federal law, for which he was never prosecuted, to countries like Iran. And you remember what he said in Iran? Louis Farrakhan was quoted as saying, "God will give the Muslims the honor of destroying America." Louis Farrakhan is part of a radical international Islamic movement that is targeting America for destruction. That's the bottom line. He believes in a holy war. And didn't we talk about a holy war? He believes in a revolutionary holy war that has already hit the shores of the United States, because I'm sure we remember the World Trade Center bombing. By the way, did you know Louis Farrakhan believes in UFOs? Perhaps these are part of the approaching war of Armageddon. In any event, Farrakhan believes that he was transported in a vision aboard the mother plane, which is his name for a flying saucer, and that he was told by Elijah Muhammad, the original leader of the Nation of Islam, that the American government has planned a war against black people. He has said this mother plane is the wheel referred to in the book of Ezekiel in the Bible. He says, quote, "These wheels will be seen all over America. You will look up one day and see them. And I don't want you to be terrified. They're your friends." A war against black people. Louis Farrakhan believes that the United States government is waging a war against black people. Lately, he's been promoting this claim, conspiracy theory, if you will, that the United States government, in particular the CIA, has been distributing crack cocaine in the inner cities of America. Now, has the CIA played a role in the drug crisis? There's no question about it. I'll give you one concrete example. Aldrich Ames. Aldrich Ames was a CIA official who ran the CIA's Counter-Narcotics Bureau for about 2 years. It turned out, of course, he was a Russian Soviet spy, thereby in a position to give our enemies all of our valuable intelligence about what we knew about the drug problem, making us even more vulnerable to it. I happen to believe what Farrakhan and his followers are promoting is designed actually to distract our attention. Distract our attention from what George Soros and his ilk have been doing to America. I think the purpose of Farrakhan's theories is to convince us that you can't trust the CIA, you can't trust the FBI, you can't trust law enforcement, you can't trust your local police. So if you can't trust any of these local police officials or law enforcement, who's going to control the problem for us? We'll see. We'll see in a minute. The point is, while the nation was preoccupied with these charges of a CIA crack cocaine connection, you know what George Soros was doing? Pouring millions of dollars in the United States into a movement to legalize drugs here. Marijuana, cocaine, LSD, and the rest of them. George Soros, in fact, together with people like Lawrence Rockefeller, poured millions of dollars into initiatives that passed in Arizona and California last November 5th, legalizing marijuana for so-called medical purposes, which most experts see as nothing but a backdoor approach to drug legalization. Now, in order to understand the future, let's think back to the past. In fact, let's think back about a classic work I know many of you have read. Remember Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. It's interesting, his brother Julian Huxley went on to become a Director General of UNESCO, the UN agency concerned about culture. Culture. And we are seeing develop a global culture. What Huxley wrote about in this book was the power of soma, which is his word for drugs. And in the book, he talked about how drugs could be used to medicate, dumb down, numb, distract a population. You get people hooked on drugs, They'll perform unskilled work without protest. They won't give any opposition to their bosses. They won't be able to think. This is the purpose of drugging America. Now we'll get back to somebody I mentioned at the start of the show. Somebody who also regards me, I suppose, as an enemy. Hugh Hefner, founder of Playboy magazine. The stereotypical dirty old man. But you know, he did more than just start a dirty magazine. And this is where I got into a confrontation with him and his magazine. I wrote a book about Playboy, not only documenting his role in pornography, but I analyzed the work of his so-called Playboy Foundation, which is not a tax-exempt foundation, therefore it's not a real foundation. It's an arm of his company, Playboy Enterprises. And I found out that the Playboy Foundation had put a lot of money into the drug legalization movement back in the 60s and 70s. In fact, his seed money started the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. In addition, I documented the fact that some of his money underwrote the court cases that eventually resulted in the Supreme Court's legalization of abortion on demand. Hefner and his collaborators virtually created the counterculture in the United States. Not only drug legalization, not only abortion rights, but strangely as it may seem, in view of the nature of his so-called Skin magazine, he also put millions of dollars into the homosexual rights movement. He did it all. He truly put his money where his mouth is. And the results of what he did, which I believe are now being continued by George Soros, have truly undermined, in fact, practically destroyed the moral foundations of this country. Here's a concrete example of the damage that continues to be done. High Times Magazine, a magazine that's geared towards young people, promoting drug use, glorifying drugs. This one happens to be a tribute to Timothy Leary, the so-called high priest of LSD, who believed that LSD could facilitate creativity and spirituality. He recommended LSD for 15-year-old kids. The 1960s, the counterculture are back thanks to George Soros. You've seen the statistics. Among teenagers, over the last 3 or 4 years, LSD use up 183%. Cocaine use up among young people 166%, marijuana use up 105%. Can you fathom the minds, the people behind these statistics? Millions of children being destroyed. When our young people buy into the drug culture, they're buying into a lot more. Again, another example of High Times Magazine with references to paganism, witchcraft. You see where they're going with this? Is it starting to all fit together? These people see drugs, these so-called mind-altering drugs, as designed to break down one's sense of oneself, creating a so-called sense of oneness between an individual and his surroundings. In fact, if you read the writings of these people who are pushing this, they believe drugs can be used to facilitate out-of-the-body experiences, mystical experiences, certain kinds of spiritual experiences. It's not surprising that some of these people who use LSD, for example, will claim that they found that God is within. If God is within, there's no need for Christ. But what is fascinating to me is what Timothy Leary was doing before he died last year. He had gotten into something else, another field of endeavor. Computers and the internet. Timothy Leary saw the potential. And don't misunderstand me, there is some good potential for computers and the internet. But unfortunately, the enemies of freedom and the enemies of our Christian values are exploiting that resource, exploiting that potential for their ends. Chaos and cyber culture. He said before he died, the personal computer is the LSD of the 1990s. That's what he said. Now think about the significance. Doesn't this help put in perspective, perhaps, the mass suicide of those UFO cult believers who were so into computers and the internet? They were using the internet as a recruiting tool. And you know, the head of that cult, a fellow named Applewhite, was a notorious drug abuser. This hasn't come out. But according to one article, quoting one of his former associates, referring to Applewhite, we'd sit around cross-legged on bean bags. He's talking about the 1970s, with incense burning. He would talk about his spiritualist stuff. The music was strange, and there were a lot of chemicals. Reefer, marijuana, hallucinogens, LSD. The drug culture is exploiting the internet in a big way, adding to our drug problem. Here's an example from High Times magazine. They have their own High Times website where they claim 60,000 cyberheads are visiting their website, their internet site every month. Children who are getting into the internet can get on and find out how to make LSD, how to grow marijuana, not to mention they can get access to hardcore pornography, even child pornography. And you know, President Clinton wants to have the internet hooked up to every public school classroom. Now, where are we going in terms of this drug problem and a possible UN role in it? This book came out last year, published by the prestigious Brookings Institution, another one of these think tanks in Washington, D.C., called Global Habit. But the critical title is the subtitle, The Drug Problem in a Borderless World. You see, ladies and gentlemen, we as a nation are not supposed to be able to solve this problem anymore. We can't do anything about it because it's a borderless world. There are open borders. So who's going to solve the drug problem for us? You got the whole world hooked. The whole world is on a habit of drugs. The author openly comes out and says, this is a problem that the United Nations has to take care of for us, specifically the World Health Organization. Certainly not the United States Army. We can't use the Army to control our borders, to police our borders. The Army's over there patrolling the borders of Bosnia. We can't use the Army to go after the foreign drug suppliers, even though we know where they're growing their drugs. That might violate the UN Charter. The result is the emergence of a global culture. This is the future, and the future is now. We are seeing the emergence of a global culture, and the United Nations recognizes it. In fact, you can say they have helped facilitate it, they are monitoring it, and they are in a position to control it. Paul Streeton, who's a consultant for the UN, put it this way. He says basically, look around the world. Look at the young people. Look at the teenagers. They're looking and sounding the same. It's the first global generation, perhaps the first generation of truly global citizens, huh? Haven't we heard that before? They're developing, he says, the same attitudes on issues like homosexuality, divorce, abortion, and you might add drugs. Global culture, the internet, an unregulated medium. A survey was actually conducted of teenagers in about 15 different countries around the world and came to the same conclusion. They share certain values: rejection of tradition, lifestyle independence. You know, these are fancy words, these are code words for rejection of traditional values. This is the new global generation. Now, what is this UN agency, UNESCO, that we keep talking about that is involved in so many different things? The UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. That's the group that is monitoring and facilitating the global culture. And it's also the same organization many years ago that honored Karl Marx. What a surprise. What a coincidence. The UN is involved in a big way. In fact, they hold conferences. One particular conference was written up in this New Age magazine called Magical Blend. The article is referred to as an account of a UN conference dealing with cyberspace, the UN, and our borderless future. And in it, he comes right out and says, this is a powerful tool. This is a weapon. It'll result in the end of nation states. Again, a borderless world, no borders. The internet is a war machine. It promotes anarchy. It will help liberate cultures. Liberation from what? To what? Liberation from the Judeo-Christian heritage. That's the liberation. And as I suggested earlier, we've already seen the downside, haven't we? Drugs, child pornography. You see the headlines just as I do. Internet eases sexual exploitation. The problem of child pornography in the United States was solved for all intents and purposes several years ago. Our U.S. postal inspectors had cracked down on the problem, had basically eliminated it because it was going through the mails. And you know it's back. It's back in a big way. In fact, FBI Director Louis Freeh was just testifying on Capitol Hill about it. The pedophiles, the child predators, are using the internet to target kids. And then they're exchanging child pornography on the internet. What a weapon it has become. If we've got this problem, and it is a problem, and it looks like we can't control it, it doesn't even look like the Supreme Court is going to uphold a congressional ban on indecency on the internet. So if the U.S. government isn't going to control the problem because of the Supreme Court, who is going to control it? Ultimately, inevitably, the government at some level is going to control it. That's the nature of reality. That's the nature of life. In this book by Harlan Cleveland, another veteran UN official, he came right out and said who's going to control it. He goes and says, basically, with all this new information technology, the unregulated medium, the impact of global culture, we're going to have a central clearinghouse in the United Nations. Who better to solve this problem? Who better to control it? Who better to monitor global culture and decide who gets what information? The UN. Remember, global problems require global solutions from the United Nations. The only question is, will this control be extended to political speech? How far will it go? That is yet to be decided. Now, there's one last problem the global elites are facing in the future, and you're all involved in this struggle. And we all know it's a real problem. The United States, in particular, is going broke. They call it the New World Fiscal Order. Have you thought about it in these terms? These authors who come from international agencies have sat down and they've analyzed the fiscal affairs of the United States and other countries. They've come to the conclusions, we cannot manage our own affairs. We just can't do it. And you have to say they have a point. We've got a $5 trillion debt. We've got federal liabilities approaching $20 trillion. It's going to come to a point, perhaps, where we're going to hit the edge of bankruptcy and maybe we'll have to go to the IMF and the World Bank for a loan or a bailout. Here's the problem in their words, in their own language. The problem is we've got an aging population, they say. People are getting older. They're living longer. But that's costing money. Those entitlement programs are costing too much money, putting too much of a burden on the next generation, they say. As you know, President Clinton has proposed a $138 billion cut in spending on Medicare over 6 years. How? By capping payments to hospitals and doctors. Now, what's going to be the inevitable result of that? Government rationed health care. Some people are going to live. Some people are going to die. At the Cleveland Clinic, it has just been revealed that patients there are being murdered, killed, injected with drugs that shorten their lives so they can come in and harvest their organs. It's happening today. In fact, one investigator into the Cleveland Clinic case came away convinced that there was, quote, a conspiracy to commit homicide on the part of hospital personnel. Once again, George Soros has come to the rescue for us. He's a forward thinker. He's thinking about the future because he's going to try to run it. He's trying to plan it for us. And one of his fancy little foundations up there in New York City now has a project he calls the Project on Death in America. They're going to try to help us understand, in his words, how to transform the current culture of dying. To me, it sounds like the famous quote that was attributed to former Governor Lamb of Colorado when he said to the elderly, basically, die and get out of the way. But you got to phrase that in a more compassionate way, you see. Can't be that blunt. Just like the campaign for so-called medical marijuana, this campaign is being framed in compassionate language. But the bottom line is still the same. He's pouring his money through this project into euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And as you know, if you see what's happening in Europe, specifically the Netherlands, all of it is coming together. In the Netherlands, they have a very liberal drug policy approaching legalization in which young people, teenagers, can actually go into government-approved coffee shops and smoke dope. And then also in the Netherlands, they have euthanasia that is practiced on a widespread basis. Does any of this sound familiar? Does it ring any bells? Let's go back in history. When have they tried this before? Michael Burley wrote this book, Death and Deliverance, Euthanasia in Germany. The Nazis perfected this. Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis systematically murdered as many as 200,000 people. This is before the Holocaust and the final solution. This was the forerunner. This is what led up to it. These were people who were said to be mentally ill, handicapped, infirmed. The Nazis had a term for them, life unworthy of life. And by the way, you know, Adolf Hitler personally disapproved of the killing of animals. He was a vegetarian, didn't eat meat. Protect the animals. What about the people? Is any of this really dissimilar from the prevailing or emerging mindset in America where we protect plants, animals, and things, and human beings are a different story? When we have endangered plants and animals protected by federal law and federal agents, but the innocent unborn are killed and the elderly are next. Think back in my talk to that book I showed on the screen by Robert Mueller, the so-called philosopher of the UN, New Genesis. You see, the future, ladies and gentlemen, is a new Genesis, in their opinion. They're recreating human society. They've got a vision for the future. They know where they're going. In fact, they want to literally recreate human society. You might say they want to reconstruct the Garden of Eden with human beings as gods, designing or creating other human beings. Sound far-fetched? Sound crazy? Are you saying at this point, well, I was with him up to now, but he's lost me. He's off his rocker. Think about where your federal tax dollars are going to right now. It's a project run out of the National Institutes for Health, captured in this book cover. It's called the Human Genome Project. Have you heard about this one? Millions of your tax dollars are going towards it. Ambitious plans. Your government is trying to map and sequence the entire human genome, which is the human genetic structure. They are mapping out, identifying the more than 100,000 different genes in the human body. Think of the power. Think of the awesome power that the human race is on the verge of acquiring. Now they're portraying this in the best possible light. They're saying, well, we're getting all this knowledge of the human genetic structure because we want to make sure that we can eliminate genetic diseases. And they have a point. They figure if they can alter a gene or alter the human genetic structure in some way, perhaps they can prevent offspring of a person or a family from growing up with a certain inherited disease. But the downside is the same power that enables a scientist or a government to be able to do that is the same power that enables the government to create a master race of people along their lines. This is the power that is now within the grasp of humanity. It's the old secret doctrine of Blavatsky. Man will become God, not only because he feels it or thinks he is, because they will have the power to do so. And in their mind, perhaps even eliminate the sinful nature of man. Do you think it's possible? It may not matter what we think. That may be their plan. In the book, Monette Vauquin is quoted as saying, she's a French writer, that in effect, the generation following the Nazis is being given the power that the Nazis never had. This is the future. The tools of eugenics beyond the wildest Hitlerian dreams. Scientists of tomorrow will have a power that exceeds all the powers known to mankind. Man is becoming God, or at least he thinks so. He's going to wield that power, and we're very close to it. Reportedly, they're going to have this power perhaps within the next 3 or 4 years. That's when they say they will have mapped out the entire human genetic structure. Those years are critical for another reason. All night I've been talking about how the United Nations is on the road to becoming a full-fledged world government. I've told you that they're not quite there. They need a power to tax, an independent taxing authority. That's essential for any government. They don't have it yet. How will they get it? Will it take a worldwide economic collapse to slip it through, to impose it in the name of restoring stability to the financial markets? And then they need that international criminal court, because every government needs a judicial branch to enforce its will. They're negotiating that treaty right now. So in conclusion, think about the future. Again, I'm not here as a prophet. I don't know what's going to transpire, but the trends are worrisome. And the question for us to consider is, will this evil get so unbearable, so unimaginable, that it will necessitate divine intervention? Will it happen? I said at the start, I thought that the United States of America was founded by people who believed in God and who wanted to establish a constitutional republic in which we had rights that came from God. They did so. They gave it to us. And the famous question is, can we keep it? Is America worth saving? Is it worth saving, ladies and gentlemen? Then with God's help, go out and save it. Thank you very much.
Let's give him our appreciation. Now, the question comes with all of this, how do we react? What's the proper thing to do? A lot of folks would want to crawl into a hole. Some people say we need to get up a good store of groceries, or maybe we need to get some gold or silver. And I think if God is telling them to do that, that is what they should do. But I also think that the Bible would tell us, seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and all these other things will be added unto you. I don't know about you, but the kind of protection that we can really count on when all of these things start coming to pass, world government, and they're going to start shutting down, by the way, radio programs like the Prophecy Club and meetings like this, because this doesn't go along with their goals. This doesn't go along with what they want to do. But the kind of protection we can count on is from God. Psalms 91 says, he that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. And I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in him will I trust. That's the kind of protection I can count on. Verse 7 says, though 1,000 fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, it will not come nigh thee. For only with thine eyes shalt thou behold and see the reward of the wicked. Now, if I have all kinds of physical preparations, but I haven't made the spiritual preparations in my heart, then I'm in trouble. You see, if we're in the flame with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Jesus is in our heart, we're okay. Whether we burn or whether we don't, we're still okay. Amen? If we're behind the barbed wire someplace, and we've lived a clean life, Jesus is in our heart, then we don't have anything to fear. Even in maybe some torture, who knows what. But again, if Jesus is there, it's going to be okay. That's the kind of protection that we can count on. I'm reminded that we had one speaker come in and talk to us, a fellow named Hammond from South Africa. And he said, of course, down there, missionaries have to be in the army first, just the way the situation is down there. He says, I was walking across a clearing, and I had my machine gun in my hand. This is the way it is if you're going to be a missionary in that area. And he says, all of a sudden, there was about 4 men popped up out of a trench over there, and all 4 of them, about 25 feet away, began bearing down on me with automatic machine gun fire. And he said, now, my natural fleshy reaction was to immediately jump behind the little bush there, which would have done nothing for me. He said, but I realized that I was already hit. There's no sense in even flinching. 4 machine guns blaring at me, I'm dead. And he said, so I just stood up and thought, well, my time had come. And he said, and I stood there for a second, I realized the bullets weren't hitting me. He said, I could hear them whistling by me. He said, I could even feel them hitting my clothes, zinging by me, zinging by my ear. He said, I could hear them hitting the ground behind me, but they weren't touching me. He said, then when I was standing straight up, looking directly into the flash of 4 machine guns firing directly at me from 25 feet away, he said, this confidence came over me. And he said, I started walking directly at them. And he said, and they looked at their guns and they cocked them and they reloaded them and they aimed to fire again, all 4 of them blaring down on me, automatic machine guns. And he said, when I got about 5 feet away and I'm standing looking into their eyes and they're looking in my eyes and they cocked their guns and they load them again and they're firing at me, all 4 of them, and not a bullet was hitting me. He said, then finally they just threw the guns down and ran off. Well, folks, that's the kind of protection I can count on. Now, how do we get that kind of protection? And how do we get our name written in the book of life? Both questions are answered this way. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Now, I don't know about you, but in my case, it was pretty easy for me to realize that I had made some mistakes. But some people out there don't think they have. The next thing we have to realize is that we cannot earn our way to heaven. We can never be good enough. We can never put enough into the plate. We can never clean the church enough. We can never help the needy or the poor enough. We cannot earn it. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for it is by grace you are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is a gift from God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Okay, if this salvation this cleaning all of the sins off of our heart is a gift, then how do we reach out and take that gift? Good question. Romans 10:9-10 says, if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God has raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, but with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. And what's that saying? It's simply saying it's not enough to say it and not believe it. But on the other hand, it's not enough to believe it and not say it. We got to say it, we got to believe it. And Acts 2:38 says, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, for the remission of your sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. But we don't hear much about that R word anymore. What is that? Repent. What does that mean? I used to do a Bible study in prisons, and I would have men come in there. Oh, sure, I'd pray the prayer. Well, sure, I'll pray the prayer. He prayed it 19 times. I'll pray it again. But see, their lives hadn't changed. Repent. What does it mean? Well, in my life, one day I sat down and decided I was going to get right with the Lord. And I said, Lord, I made a mess of my life. But I'll tell you what, if you'll forgive me my sins, if you'll give me another chance, if you'll wipe it clean, from here on out, I promise I'm yours. I promise I'll follow your laws. I promise I'll read your book and learn what is in your book, and I'll do my best to follow it. Now, does that mean we're perfect? No, but it means our objective is to be perfect. Now, repent simply means I was following my life, doing what I wanted to do, and I decided instead to follow God's laws. And that's what you're making when you say, Jesus, come to my heart. I'm saying from here on out, I'm going to do my best to follow God's laws, to do it His way. Holy Spirit, I ask you to go out and knock on the hearts of those people that are here in the audience and those folks that may be watching on the video, that they would not put it off, that they would make the decision right now to get their life cleaned up so God can protect them in the day of trouble and to get their name written in the book of life in Jesus' name. Let's all bow our head, no one looking around. And yes, you may have said it before. It's still good to say it again. Let's all say it. Dear Heavenly Father, I admit I'm a sinner, and I confess with my mouth, and I believe in my heart that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, died on the cross, arose 3 days later, sits at the right hand of the Father. I ask Him to forgive my sins, come into my life, keep me holy, and save me in the day of trouble. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, there's a lot of folks that like to think, well, that's all you have to do. Pray that one little prayer. You're saved. You can go on and live like the devil. But boy, that's not what my Bible tells me. Matthew 7:21 says, not everyone that cries, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but those that doeth the will of the Father. It's not over in another way, because Matthew 10:32-3 says, whosoever confesses me before men, him will I also confess before my Father, which is in heaven. Whosoever denies me before men, him will I also deny before my Father, which is in heaven. All it's saying is, whatever comes out of your mouth to your friends and neighbors and relatives, that's what He'll profess for you. And there's too many folks out there that want to secretly say, yes, I'm a Christian, but wouldn't dare let the coworker or the boss know. Do you have that kind of courage? Now, not to embarrass anyone, but so that you can have the opportunity to have Matthew 10:32-3 fulfilled in your life, so you have the opportunity with your mouth to a group of people to say, Jesus is Lord. If you prayed that prayer for the very first time, would you raise your hand?